Okay, welcome everybody. Lovely to see so many participants showing up. You won't see each other, but I can see that participants are coming in. So yeah, just want to say welcome everyone to the webinar this evening. I'll just share a few technical points ahead. So yes, this webinar is being recorded so that we can post it online on our Stop Climate Chaos YouTube. If you'd like to follow up on any of the information raised, you'll be able to check in on it again. The presenters and the host will have their camera on, but we can't see you, like I said. And if you have any questions that will come up throughout the session today, you can submit a question through the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of the screen. And we'll try and bring any questions forward that have not been addressed already by our speakers and perhaps allows us to go a bit deeper. My name is Sarah Hurley. I'm the Stop Climate Chaos Coordinator, and I'm supported by my colleague here, Sean McLaughlin from Friends of the Earth. So we're really delighted to share this next hour with you, our fellow Stop Climate Chaos Coalition members who are just running a little bit late from a meeting, and our very special guests observing the negotiations from Belém and in Dublin. So you should see my slides in a moment. Hold on. How's that looking to everybody? Thumbs up from Dearbhla. Yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, we're here at the webinar today and we've got the topic is live from Belém. As you know, we're in the second week now in the COP negotiations from COP 2030, COP30. And Stop Climate Chaos, we're a coalition of over 30 organizations across many organizing spaces, from environment and climate, student and youth, faith-based groups, international development, health, and peace and justice. We've been active since 2007, working on policy, advocacy, and mobilizing for fast, fair, and funded climate action. While there have been many successes, as you've seen, some of the highlights there on the screen, we know that there's so much more to do. On Saturday, many of you might have joined in your thousands on the National Climate Demonstration, which we held in solidarity on the Global Day of Action, which was a really fantastic moment. It was our largest climate demo that we've seen in Ireland since the youth strikes in 2019. The movement is ready to push back, I think, on this narrative of apathy around climate. And I'm really glad that we have the opportunity now to take the international perspective into our awareness raising today from our speakers and how you, the participants now, can look at that and how to bring that into your conversations going forward. So our lovely panel of speakers today will be joining us. So we have Sinéad Loughran, Ross Fitzpatrick, Mohammed Usrof, and Dearbhla Richardson. We're going to kick it off, and I'm going to pass over to Mohammed first. You're very welcome, Mohammed. Mohammed is from the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy, and he is calling from Belém, as you can see, in a very nice sunny climate, a warmer climate. So over to you, Mohammed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Hi, everybody. My name is Mohammed. I'm also joined by Sinéad and Ross here in Belém at COP30. So very excited and honored to be with Dearbhla and with the rest of the panel and to speak about this really crucial moment. So I've been here in COP for the past week and a bit, and it's been quite dramatic ever since it started, partially because of the lack of civic space, safety, but also partially because this is one of the first COPs in the past few years where people were actually able to demonstrate and to express either content or discontent with the process. It started off in day one with a delay in the negotiations, but also a delay in us being able to do actions. And in the second day, we had what we saw as indigenous people raiding the venue, in which the UNFCCC and the UN venue security and largely the Brazilian police reacting quite dramatically with military intervention. And that has remain quite consistently all throughout the rest of the COP. That has had large repercussions on the space inside, where our Palestine actions were taken down, and a lot of it just couldn't continue. Now, I want to take a step back and just recognize what we are here as Palestinians in this COP, because this year we were joined with the Palestine COP30 coalition that includes Stop the Wall coalition, that includes the BDS National Committee, alongside Friends of the Earth Palestine and many other groups. For us as the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy, we were here as a delegation working on multiple topics. Besides following just transition, we were looking at the energy embargo. Brazil is a complicit state, and the last few COPs were taking place in complicit countries, that being the UAE, now complicit in the genocide in Sudan, but also the Azerbaijani government that has claimed that fossil fuels are the gift of the earth, sent to God and sent by the heavens. And that is not an attitude that we should condone, and not even one that we should condone to be hosting or to allow to be hosting a COP process or a climate change negotiation process. We've seen the gas deals that took place in Azerbaijan, and we recognize more than ever before that this COP is also compromised. It began with, first of all, earlier this year, around February till April, Confederation of Oil Workers sending a joint letter to Lula, the president of Brazil, saying that we need an energy embargo and we need to end complicity with Israel now, especially after the ICJ case. That has been dismissed. However, in the last few months, things have been changing, and there has been a shift in attitude from Lula to hold the government more accountable. However, that is still not yet met. We've worked with the unions, and on our website, you can check more. You can find more information about the investigation on the energy embargo, where we see that Brazil has circumvented the supply chain and the logistics of oil and imperialism, and has been sending oil to Italy instead, and Italy has been sending them to Israel. Our calls to action have been very clear, and it's to mobilize unions and dock workers and to ensure that a just transition is not just a transition of energy consumption, where we keep consuming more and more and more, but rather a transition of substitution and not addition. We cannot keep adding to our consumption. We need to substitute what we consume and substitute a system that allows for such imperial logistics to occur. So what that call has awakened in the eyes of many, especially here in the COP30 process, but also in Italy and in South Africa against Glencore, and in Turkey and in Colombia, especially in Colombia being one of the more successful cases, is this awareness of what an energy transition really means, what green colonialism looks like, and how that is vivid and visible and clear in the negotiation process. So far, we see that Italy and Brazil are now complicit with the supply chains of oil, and we call on unions and dock workers to mobilize. And in 2 weeks' time from now, we have major campaigns against or in those different cities. We've mobilized the unions here. We've worked on campaigns and political education on both the oil supply chain, but also how to mobilize unions. And this is something that is really clear and direct as a way for people to unite and to mobilize moving forward. One of the other things that we've seen here in this technocratic process is how technocratic language completely aims to avoid power. We've seen how in the Just Transition dialogue, people are avoiding the Belém action mechanism, and we're happy to discuss the Belém action mechanism, especially through Ross and Sinéad's and Dearbhla's sort of presentation. But for us as sort of observers in this negotiation process, where everyone is talking about finance and mitigation and just transition, we have to understand who is it that whose knowledge counts in this case, and whose land is being taken in the process, and whose lives are expendable and remain to be unaddressed. The reason I started off by talking about the indigenous people who have been trying to come into the venue and have been trying to show their voice in the process is because of the fact that the negotiation process has completely excluded them. We have seen logos and symbols all across the COP that claims that COP30 is for everyone, but we've seen how they've taken military action and intervention against the people of Belém, whose this conference is being hosted on their land. As long as they're being excluded from the process, this cannot be a holistic or a just process. A feminist transition is not going to be met when we're discussing it while taking other people's land. A just transition is never going to be met if Petrobras, the Brazilian company that is sending oil to Israel, is right in front of the venue, And it's not going to happen when we are in the same spaces as Israeli ministers, and we're not going to be able to make any form of change if we're in the same space as Maersk and as every other complicit corporation. I've been invited to events where Google and Amazon and their sustainability departments were present, and it was all an attempt to sanitize and to wash their hands off of the blood of Palestinians and the blood that they've had of colonialism and extraction and exploitation all the way from Sudan to Congo to even Ireland. So these colonial patterns, we cannot allow them to continue. And they're the same ones from every other COP. They're the same ones in Dubai, and then there's the same ones in Baku. So that active suppression of the political truth, that active dismissal of a proper negotiation process, of threats of expulsion, threats of badge removals. Yesterday, we had a major event against, it was generally an event about energy, imperialism, infrastructure, just transition. But it so just happened that it was next to where an Israeli, the director of international relations of the Israeli Ministry of Agriculture was speaking. So we had hundreds of people mobilizing in that pavilion in what the UNFCCC would consider legal because it was under our pavilion. And that was a complete and straight up just direct demonstration of power. And it just says that we reject being in the same process of people who are committing genocide, especially when they're talking about food and agriculture and innovative food systems. So, and being threatened by the UN is also another portrayal of the reality. And it is that this process is not for us. So I hope that our work within the Institute as PICS allows us to achieve a more holistic process through mobilizing unions and dock workers, through working with Indigenous people to include their voices in the process so that an energy embargo is achieved, so that the negotiation items, if you go to our website and see the toolkit that we have that we've distributed to the venue, you can see how we sort of dissect each and every negotiation theme and topic within a Palestinian lens, within a decolonial lens, so that we can actually have the language that we need in the negotiations. So I'll just leave it there. This is so-called the People's COP in Brazil, and so far it has served nothing and no one but corporations and other complicit governments in genocide, and this needs to stop, and we hope that global mobilizations can begin to together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you for starting us off by giving us quite a critical analysis of the week so far and the kind of the building of previous COPs that you've mentioned. It's really interesting to think about how are these negotiations perhaps perpetuating different actions or activities that we're trying to actively work against within these structures, and if they're not named and if they're not progressed forward, like how are we to improve situations? How are we to have inclusion? How are we to have a feminist transition? How are we to have a just transition? So thank you so much, and I'm sure people will have lots of questions following that. So thank you so much. If it's okay, I'd love to pass on over to Sinead. Sinead Loughran is the climate policy advisor for Trócaire and has been a part of numerous COPs. So Sinead, tell us a little bit about COP30 and how you've been getting on there. Thank you.
Thanks for having me for the introductory section. Yeah, to I suppose talk a little bit about what how COP has been going so far. We have seen I suppose some positives in the sense that this year the presidency has been described as quite process orientated, but also have explicitly said that they don't want to place agreement texts or draft texts in front of anyone without having discussion and meaningful negotiations on it. So that is obviously a huge step forward to last year by from at COP29 and the NCQG being forced through in the end with very little of the global South needs incorporated into that agreement. Ultimately was a failure and a joke and a betrayal, as so many had said in the follow-up remarks of that agreement being pushed through. So I suppose to look at some of the items that the presidency of the COP have been consulting on with parties, one of the key items that is really critical to averting the worst impacts of climate change and delivering on climate justice. For example, are the NDCs and the ambition and implementation gap for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the primary temperature objective under the Paris Agreement, and as clarified by the ICJ's advisory opinion this summer. And then obviously around climate finance, and I know Ross will speak more to that. So there are other items as well around trade measures and biennial transparency reports, but I'll focus mostly on the NDCs and fishing cap for the moment. So the EU's NDC is among those NDCs which was submitted before COP30, submitted very late, obviously, but it's also not adequate and doesn't reflect the EU's fair share of climate action. And this is a common scenario across the NDCs that have been submitted by Global North, the historically higher living states have already submitted their NDCs. And essentially this kind of process to discuss it and to get an outcome on it at COP is to really close that ambition and implementation gap to make sure that we get on track with 1.5 degrees Celsius as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres had called for in September. And what we're hearing, a lot from the EU is, the EU is the most ambitious and amongst the most ambitious and will be, but it's being presented in a way as almost like the EU is almost overachieving on their climate targets or over delivering in some way, shape or form. But ultimately this comes down to the EU's obligations and the principles of equity and common but differentiating responsibilities and respective capabilities, where the EU actually is mandated by the Paris Agreement, by international law, to do more because it is one of those historically highly states. So this kind of idea that, oh, well, the EU is more most ambitious and we should be commended for that, it's simply holding the EU to account on their obligations. And what we're seeing right now from their industry does not reflect their fair share of obligations. So ultimately, we do need to see an outcome from this COP that ensures that the EU and other historically high emitting states revise their NDCs to align with that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. And a fossil fuel declaration has to be part of addressing the 1.5 degrees Celsius gap. And again, that is not clear in the EU's NDC, the kind of timeline, I guess. And I say that with quotes that they've provided is very vague. It would allow fossil fuels to continue to be used in the EU up to 2050. And we know from the ICJ advisory opinion and from very clear guidance from UN experts on human rights that those historically high emitting states actually need to phase out by 2030 in line with their obligations. So that the EU will consider having some sort of timeline that can allow them to use fossil fuels into the 2040s and 2050 is completely inadequate. So moving to then another kind of key aspect of that has kind of I suppose progressed in the last week or so is the kind of declarations and proposals around fossil fuel phase out or transitioning away from fossil fuels. And there's been a few different proposals put forward, but essentially the core kind of component of that is building upon the COP28 outcome to transition away from fossil fuels. And obviously now we have the backing of the ICJ's advisory opinion that provides a lot of clarification on state applications. And it's obviously not a new law, it's simply clarifying the laws that already existed. But that, along with the guidance from UN experts, is very helpful in pushing this further and actually making progress in phasing out fossil fuels. So around 80 countries currently have supported one of these calls and the roadmap for transitioning away from fossil fuels. We are hearing that there is support amongst the EU member states around it as well. But ultimately we need to make sure that this isn't a delay tactic. Essentially, there needs to be tangible action coming out of this COP because the obligations of states are already clear. So it can't be simply agreeing to another dialogue, or it needs to really put into motion those already very obvious and explicit obligations that are in states to phase out fossil fuels, starting with the historically high emitting states and very wealthy states, and then allowing a just transition for global south states as well, ensuring that a just and equitable phase out to happen globally, and that obviously requires kind of finance too. I will just briefly as well, like the fund for responding to loss and damage, as it's something that Ireland played quite a critical role in setting up, and you know, the agreement to set up the fund was put in place 3 years ago, but we are now at the point where the fund's startup phase has been launched at this COP with kind of a celebratory announcement or a ceremonial announcement, and the kind of application system for funding will open in December. But after all of the fanfare, and obviously it's a huge win to get fund for responding to loss and damage, it's such a critical and necessary for climate justice to be delivered. But after all of the fanfare and all of the work that's gone into it, we see that the fund for responding to loss and damage remains an empty shell and is critically underfunded. So like a fraction of 1% of annual loss and damage finance needs is available in the fund for this startup phase. And even if all pledges were paid in, it was still only be a fraction of 1% annual needs there. We are not hearing of any new pledges from Ireland or the EU. The EU in their initial pledge to the fund. And there are also critical issues over community access to the fund and the fund's ability to respond to sudden onset events that still exist as well. And there are attempts in relation to those issues in negotiation rooms to water down those obligations that were outlined in the agreement that operationalised the fund 2 years ago as well. So we really to see very clear guidance to the fund, and obviously no watering down of already established obligations for the fund to provide direct access to communities and to be able to respond to sudden or rapid onset events. And then just finally just to finish some of the other points is that the influence of harmful and powerful polluters and industries is still very clear at this COP, and then Mohammed referenced, you know, the presence of fossil fuel companies, and many people on the call might have seen the analysis that was released late last week on the number of fossil fuel lobbyists at COP, which proportionally is 12% more than last year's, and exceeds all the allegations at COP except for the person who did negation. And then also that the Centre for International Environment Law yesterday produced research on the number of carbon capture and storage lobbyists who are also at COP, who essentially continue to prop up the fossil fuel industry and not provide these so-called solutions that they are claiming to deliver. So I think that's I'll leave it there and pass over perhaps back to you, Sarah, but happy to take
Brilliant. Thank you, Sinead. And I've just had some messages in the chat about sometimes it's a little bit challenging to hear, but unfortunately it's a bit of a reality sometimes for our participants who are trying to find a space in very largely loud areas. But I got majority of it, so apologies again. And looks like Ross managed to find himself somewhere else. So I wonder, Ross, are you in a slightly more quiet space?
Hi, Sarah. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, loud and clear. Thank you.
I
So yeah, pass on back to you if that's okay. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, and just let me know if the sound quality isn't good, because I just got a message to say that my internet connection isn't very stable.
Gotcha.
So
Okay, well, for the time
just
of
let me
being,
know.
yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, unfortunately, the story of COP30 is a very familiar one to anyone who's followed over the past few years. Despite all the warnings from the scientific community we've seen in the last few weeks, and all of the rhetoric about this being a COP of implementation, the reality is that very little tangible progress has been made in the negotiating rooms in Belém. I want to go into a bit more detail on what's happening in relation to climate finance. But before that, I think it's worth commenting on two things. And the first is in relation to the absence of the US administration. And the second is in relation to the presence of indigenous communities and the protests we've seen in Belém. So on the US absence, Trump's refusal to send a delegation and his decision to once again withdraw from the Paris Agreement, I think it's fair to say, cast a pretty dark shadow over this COP from the outset. But actually, from what I'm hearing on the ground, many delegates are actually quite happy that the Trump administration isn't here. The US, even under Democratic administrations, has been a perpetual blocker of progressive climate action at COP for decades. So I think there are very few people in the negotiating rooms that are lamenting their absence. Having said that, the intimidation that we saw at the IMO negotiations a few weeks ago, where for anyone who wasn't following, the US essentially torpedoed the talks at the last minute and prevented a new deal on cutting shipping emissions. That is obviously a real cause for concern. And I think the really dangerous thing is that this type of politics of intimidation is already having the desired effect to a certain extent in the EU. We've already seen this with the US exert significant pressure on EU leaders over its new human rights and environmental due diligence law, which was effectively dismantled by the European Parliament last week. It's not clear yet whether US intimidation tactics will influence the outcome of this COP, but it is worrying, I suppose, to see EU leaders willing to bow the knee so quickly when pressured by the US about EU environmental legislation. And I think that's something it's definitely worth keeping an eye on, particularly when Ireland is developing its messaging ahead of its EU presidency next year. And then the second thing I wanted to touch on before talking a bit more about climate finance is on the presence of indigenous communities here in Belém. So I've been to the last three COPs. This is my fourth, and I can safely say that this has been one of the most symbolically important parts of COP30 compared to the last few years where the summit took place in countries where protest was essentially banned. And the presence of indigenous Brazilian communities at the venue every single day has really acted as a stark reminder to the world's media of the significance that these negotiations have in the real world, particularly across the Amazon, where communities are literally fighting for their survival on a daily basis. But as Mohammed mentioned, it's also been deeply worrying to see the extent to which the UNFCCC has acted to suppress dissent within the venue. So it's far from perfect, but I think it's still worth mentioning relative to the last few years that it has been a slight improvement. Okay, so on to climate finance, and I'll try to keep it as brief as I can because I want to leave time for questions. But basically, one of the main sticking points in Belém, as with most previous COPs, is climate finance. And what we're talking about here is the money that is owed to developing countries by the wealthy, historically polluting nations whose greenhouse gas emissions cause the climate crisis. That is essentially what developing countries are calling for at this COP and have been calling for decades now. And I suppose a big reason for the renewed emphasis on climate finance this year is it's twofold. It's both the historical failure of wealthy countries to meet their climate finance obligations, but it's also because of the really weak NCQG decision in Baku last year that Sinead already mentioned. So this year, developing countries are calling for the inclusion of an explicit agenda item on the implementation of Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. And that article establishes the legal obligation of wealthy countries to take the lead in providing climate finance. But despite being a long-established obligation under the Paris Agreement, and also being recognized as such by the International Court of Justice earlier this year, pretty much every developed country is opposed to this proposal. And their argument is that a new agenda item isn't needed, and that developed countries are already living up to their finance obligations, and that these questions can be addressed under the existing negotiation tracks. And even in Ireland, despite a long-standing commitment to the provision of climate finance and rhetorical support for climate justice, we've shown very little willingness so far to depart from this view. Although We did just hear from Darragh O'Brien in a meeting with the Irish delegation that Ireland might be willing to vocalise a different view within the EU on this. So that remains to be seen, and we'll see how that develops over the course of the week, but it's worth keeping an eye on. Unfortunately, though, and despite what developed countries claim, history has shown that climate finance has just not been provided at anywhere near the scale required. So this proposal is very much about injecting a renewed sense of urgency on the need for massively scaled up delivery of finance. And it's probably the single most important signal that we are standing in solidarity with the demands of developing countries. And I think one of the key litmus tests of success for COP will be whether it can deliver a political signal to this effect. The Brazilian presidency is currently leading high-level negotiations with heads of delegation to try and come up with a compromise decision on this by the end of the week. And, you know, I think the best way that Ireland can contribute, in addition to kind of vocalizing a different view within the EU, is through concrete actions domestically. And for Christian Aid, this basically boils down to three key political asks. So first, we need Ireland to scale up its international climate finance to at least 500 million euros a year based on our fair share. Second, we need to see a new pathway developed for reaching our fair share of the new inadequate target that was agreed in Baku last year. And third, as Sinead mentioned, we need to make new contributions to the loss and damage fund, which has been stuck at around 700 million US dollars since COP28. And for anyone watching this who's attending the lobby day in December, these are points that can and should be raised with politicians. I'm conscious about leaving some time for questions, so I'll leave it there for now. And yeah, happy to answer any questions from the audience. Thanks.
Brilliant, Ross. Thank you so much. And as I was trying to prepare a question to ask you, well, what can we do next? You've already kind of answered us already. What can Irish population do, considering we'll be meeting the TDs soon? So maybe we can ask a few more questions about that when we get to the Q&A. Thanks so much. Okay, so I'd love to introduce Dearbhla Richardson next. And Dearbhla is the European campaigner for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Dearbhla is based in Dublin, and she's in Dublin currently, but we wanted to bring her along today because there's so much that's happening with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty at COP. But there's also so much action that we should be considering here in Ireland as well. So I'd love to hear more from you, Dearbhla, about your kind of opinion, your analysis, what's been happening at COP, and maybe telling people a little bit more about the treaty if they haven't heard it before.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And it was great to hear from all of the speakers on the ground at COP. Many of my colleagues are there at the moment, and yeah, I don't know how many members of our audience have been, but they're incredibly draining and challenging conferences to be a part of. So just to say thanks to everyone who's there at the moment, fighting for a better future for us. But yeah, I suppose just in terms of a very brief introduction to the Fossil Fuel Treaty itself. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty is a proposed global agreement to phase out fossil fuels in line with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, in line with the target set out in the Paris Agreement. So it is hasn't been created yet, but the idea behind it is that it would be a complementary process to the Paris Agreement, and that it wouldn't in any way undermine the UN as it stands, but that it would act as perhaps an alternative mechanism for us to create some form of binding fossil fuel phase out plan. Because as we know, up until COP28, the words like fossil fuels or any kind of mentioned fossil fuels was actually left out of any of our texts in our climate agreements. So I suppose just our kind of main, I guess, points with the treaty is that the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis, and for the last decade, oil, gas, and coal have been responsible for 86% of the CO2 pollution heating our planet. And despite this, government and industry plans would actually increase extraction, putting us on a path to produce 120% more fossil fuels by 2030 than what is safe for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So we're racing in the opposite direction of science and safety. And the damage from fossil fuel fuels extends far beyond climate change. So we can see from the entire life cycle of fossil fuels, from extraction to combustion, that they undermine global health, security, and justice, and cause so many millions of premature deaths in cities worldwide. But yeah, I suppose this call to action is not coming from one group or one sector. It's a unified demand from the world's major religions, indigenous people on the front lines, global public health leaders at the World Health Organization, trade unions representing workers, and the young people who will inherit this planet. And it's a universal call for human survival and dignity. So most recently, the largest environmental body, the IUCN, endorsed the call for a fossil fuel treaty, and among those were a number of European countries who kind of supported this call as well. And basically what we would like to see throughout the I guess agreements made in COP is some form of direction that kind of follows that, and also follows the most recent ICJ ruling, that we have a moral obligation to, look after our planet and to limit global warming as best we can. So in terms of, I guess, positive news that has come out of COP so far, the fossil fuel treaty currently, well, up until yesterday, had 17 participating states, and yesterday Cambodia announced their support. So there's now 18 states who are a party to the fossil fuel treaty, and the first conference for international phase out of fossil fuels will be held in April next year. Colombia is hosting it. But so it was kind of amid discussions around a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels at a high-level briefing organized as part of the action agenda. The Kingdom of Cambodia announced its support for the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. So it was His Excellency Song Sophorn, Secretary of State at the Council of Ministers, who spoke of Cambodia's intention to continue engaging and collaborating as the 18th nation state party to the initiative. So I have a quote from him, which I thought would be nice just to read out here, just that Cambodia stresses that developing countries cannot undertake this transition alone. We required enhanced international support, including climate finance, technology transfer, capacity development, and partnerships to diversify our energy systems and ensure that workers and communities are not left behind. So I guess what I'd like to kind of take and highlight from that is that we still have much to do, and even when we look at the 18 participating states of the fossil fuel treaty, they are all in the global south, and we really need Western governments and so-called developed states to to take responsibility for the crisis that they have caused, and to show leadership where it is required, and to give financial and technical support in this transition, because those countries really need the support to do it. But yeah, I know, conscious that we want time for questions, but just to share some other good news is that earlier, I think it might have been last week, so on the 13th of November, we had a launch of the Journey Fund. So essentially, the Journey Fund is an innovative fund that links government's fossil fuel phase out commitments with investing expertise to drive attractive returns and build regenerative post-fossil economies. So essentially kind of giving the angle to countries that prioritize their economy to come with us in this transition in a way that is economically, I suppose, appealing to them. But so that's a joint initiative between the Journey Fund, Bridging Ventures, and the Fossil Fuel Treaty. So that launched recently, last week. I will stop talking now because I'm aware I've been talking for a while. But yeah, I'll hand it back to you, Sarah, and yeah, happy to answer any questions people may have.
That's brilliant, Dearbhla. And I think, I was pulling up the website there because I remember there being the Dublin City Council has endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I was what I didn't know was that Dún Laoghaire Rathdown had also done so, and Fingal County Council, South Dublin City County Council, and I was aware that Cork City Council have also endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So maybe if I can stick with a question for the Q&A and ask you, Dearbhla, how might we as voters here or as constituents bring this to a kind of across Ireland, like raising this issue? You already talked about the sort of the values of like naming human survival and dignity as being a really big part of the messaging and talking about fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. But how is it that like values-based campaigning and language help us to like collectively work together to bring this to our decision makers?
So I think in terms of Ireland, our kind of way forward with this is speaking in terms of solidarity. So with other small island states who are most vulnerable to the changing climate. So when I speak of those small island states, I think of Vanuatu, who's one of the participating states in the fossil fuel treaty, and Vanuatu's climate minister, Ralph Regenvanu, actually visited Ireland in June this year and met with our Minister of State with responsibility for international development, Minister Neil Richmond. And it was kind of, I guess, just a stark reminder of, I suppose, that sense of solidarity that we need to have as a small island, to the states who don't have as much of a say at the table as other bigger states. And I guess, just going back to that kind of whole moral responsibility as well, that we have caused this. I know that not any one individual wants to think of themselves as holding responsibility. So I guess it's that shared responsibility that we have, especially as a rich state who has done an incredible amount to contribute to this. But I think in terms of that kind of for me anyway, the way to kind of phrase that is to think about our other small island states, that we have kind of a my brain is thinking in Irish, but a dualgate, like a responsibility to just to protect them as well. But yeah, so I just ask if anyone is going to the Mass Lobby Day. Hopefully everyone here is, but just to ask your representatives to consider supporting the fossil fuel treaty and getting Ireland to participate in discussions and in the conference next year, just because of that responsibility that we hold to look after our siblings in other small island states who are more vulnerable to climate change than we are currently.
Yeah, thank you, Dearbhla. And I would like to invite Mohammed in a moment, but I know that he's just kind of come back on the call. So I just wanted to frame that as like a collective responsibility that we can share to build solidarity across nations and across different vulnerabilities. And Dearbhla was talking specifically about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty being a place which we can accept some responsibility within the global North countries to be able to lead and to affect this change and support change too. Mohammed, when you spoke about the energy embargo and oh, he's gone now, so maybe I'll just come back to him in a bit. Sinead, you're still with us. Are you there still? Yes.
You can hear me better, but I will try and speak up. Sorry, everyone.
Okay, thank you. You talked about the NCQGs, and I think we can often, the problem with climate sort of talk sometimes is that we come to a lot of like acronyms. Can you explain a little bit what an NCQG is and what is the sort of position that we can here put pressure on our government, considering that we also have the US presidency coming up, and what does that actually mean in terms of our power and our ability to feed into the negotiations for next year as well?
Yeah, so the the NCQG, and stop me if this isn't clear, anyone. The NCQG is a new collective quantified goal. Oh, sorry, Ross, you're here if you would like to speak to this more on, because I think you were talking about it originally, so please feel free to jump in.
Sorry, my internet connection just went down. What was it? You can go ahead, Sinead. I can jump in and compliment.
Okay. Okay, we're just talking about the NCQG, so yeah, feel free to jump in. So essentially it was agreed on, it was pushed through in the the final stages of COP29 last year in Baku. And essentially it's, you know, the obligations on states, rich historically high emitting states, based on their responsibility for driving climate change and their capacity to pay for climate finance, is enshrined in the UNFCCC, in the UN's Climate Convention and in the Paris Agreement. And this new collective quantified goal was supposed to set a new climate finance goal that would meet the needs of besides climate vulnerable countries. And what we saw was nothing close to that. And I suppose from an Irish perspective, Ireland's fair share of climate finance currently for mitigation and adaptation is 500 million euro per year. And the government will set a target of 225 million per year to reach by 2025. But obviously that's a long way short of 500 million. And actually our obligations are increasing because climate finance needs have increased as well, and even under the inadequate NCQG. So we need to see a big shift in terms of the amount of finance that's provided from Ireland to global south countries, or developing countries is the term that's used in the UN text on this. And then in terms of loss and damage as well, it was completely marginalised within the NCQG. And as I said earlier, for anyone that was able to hear, that the loss and damage fund has been completely marginalised and remains critically underfunded. And the analysis that Sinéad and Trócaire did on Ireland's fair share of loss and damage finance would say that Ireland's fair share of, loss and damage finance would say that it's at 1.5 billion per year by 2030. And these numbers do seem really big, and obviously there's lots of domestic just transition needs as well. But actually, if you were to take all of the kind of measures that Ireland could implement, in terms of introducing a wealth tax, on introducing taxes on polluting investments, in terms of actually regulating and taxing those industries that are very highly polluting and pay very little taxes, if any at all, like the aviation industry, on things like their polluting fuel and so on. Some of the estimates that we put together earlier this year in one of our reports estimated that Ireland could, you know, raise over 9 billion euro per year to go towards those international climate finance needs for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and also for just transition needs at home in Ireland as well. So there are definitely opportunities, and we need to push our politicians to introduce those kinds of measures. So
Yeah, go ahead, Ross. Thanks.
Sorry for dropping off. My internet is a bit shaky. I just wanted to respond quickly to, there's a question from Andrew in the chat about the nature of climate finance and where it should come from. And basically it's all of the above. I mean, the main ask is that developed countries scale up their provision of climate finance, and that means bilaterally to countries. It also means via multilateral institutions and also through the UN climate funds. But I suppose the really key thing to highlight is that it's very important that this money is provided in the form of grants, because a lot of climate finance currently is provided in the form of loans, which creates additional unsustainable debt on developing countries who are already struggling. And as Sinead mentioned, we're talking about enormous sums of money here, but it is important to remember that it's a fraction of global GDP. I mean, the UN has estimated that around 5 to 6 trillion US dollars is needed by developing countries out to 2030. But in 2022 alone, 7 trillion US dollars worth of subsidies were poured into the fossil fuel industry. So it's really important to remember that when you hear from politicians that, you know, we just don't have the public money available, that you push back on that. The finance is available. It's just going to the wrong places. So what that looks like in terms of a political ask from Ireland is that we both need Ireland to scale up its climate finance, but we also need the government to be much more engaged in international efforts to introduce the new forms of taxation that Sinead was talking about. So taxes on big polluters and on extreme wealth, because if we do that, even though it might be politically difficult, it will allow us to raise the revenue necessary to fund climate action rather than having to rely on loans or private finance. So this is something that Ireland really needs to push for within the EU bloc. And I would say it's very important that we put this on the agenda during our presidency of the EU next year as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ross. There's a question here that I'd like to answer. So Eleanor Duff made a comment saying that there needs to be continued support for people at home during cold weather, and how can people heat their homes now? We also need to look at people's desire to travel and the war machines, as well as how we heat our homes. I think that's a part of like a just energy transition too. So, you know, within all our campaigning and advocacy, we're ensuring that we're wanting polluters to pay their fair share first. It's not that we're looking to increase taxes on the people that have done the least. We're looking at really the big players in this. And I think that's one of the sort of messaging or kind of communication strategies that get pushed back against in the media or by politicians who aren't wanting to lead on a fair energy transition. So all our campaigns with the Just Transition, specifically within groups that are connected to Stop Climate Chaos, warm homes, cheaper energy bills, cost of living crisis, agriculture, like our healthy environment, these are all connected issues. And I suppose I hope people here today can see those connecting issues between what our presenters have raised. Okay, and we're kind of coming into our final moments now. And Mohammed, I see that you're back, and I wonder, how's your internet connection doing? Hello.
It's a bit, I'm quite unsure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. When we were speaking with Dearbhla earlier, we were talking about the importance of solidarity across like from more developed high income nations towards communities that are most at risk at the moment. And one of those things was around like fossil fuel phase outs and I suppose and the impact that fossil fuels has on communities. And Dearbhla was speaking about like countries such as like Vanuatu. And I think putting it in the context of Ireland as well, that just transition, we should be looking at our energy sources. So Ireland is at risk of bringing in fracked gas, fracked LNG. And we also have a massive amount of data centers. And the connecting link between fossil fuels, data centers, these industries, like you say, they're very real for the justice issue in Palestine. And I wondered if you could help maybe draw some of those connections for us. Like, what is the relationship around militarism and energy, but also maybe some of the larger corporations that you're seeing at COP?
Yeah. So when it comes to, you've mentioned data centers, and me and Sinead and Ross just spoke about how Dublin and the University College Dublin UCD hosts the Intel data centers that are quite consuming of energy, but are at the same time complicit in genocide. I think the key thing to remember here, especially when we're talking about international solidarity and when we're talking about climate, militarism, genocide, ecocide, and the sort of technical processes, and how a lot of it is reflected in the process, but about also the people who drive these processes. When we lack international solidarity, even as Palestinians, we lack solidarity and sympathy and empathy and even collaborative work, or even the vision for collaborative work with people from Kiribati, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Fiji, Aruba. You know, those states are most prone to ecocide, and they're most prone to extinction if we don't act soon. So when it comes to responsibilities, or at least the common but differentiated responsibilities that I know that Ross talked about, how Ireland needs to pay up, how every other government needs to pay up in response to their own sort of responsibility around the world for military missions and so on. I think it's really crucial to just recognize that. I also want to take a pause to see if I'm heard.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, as long as my voice is audible. So yeah, and when it comes to the fossil fuel sort of non-proliferation,
You've just stalled a little bit, Mohammed.
Sorry, Sarah. I think the internet is really bad here, so Mohammed's just going to join on my laptop first.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to use my headphones or do you speak? Up to you. Whichever you.
I mean, if I,
It's already connected.
let's do it. Hello.
Hi there. Yeah, you're good.
Sorry, all. Well, what I was saying is that the ties to the fossil fuel industry and militarism is clearly connected. The Fossil Fuel Treaty has worked on a report that shows that there are 9 ways that fossil fuel and militarism are connected. For me as a Palestinian, they are connected. And for me as a Palestinian, seeing how fracking industries, as you said, how many other governments and countries are complicit in fracking industries, it's really crucial for me to see how to support the people on the ground in Colombia and in South Africa and in every other nation in the world. Part of that is because a lot of these corporations like Coca-Cola and Nestle and PepsiCo do target these union workers who retaliate because of the fracking industry, or even because of the exploitation, or because of the pollution that harms families. We know the exposure of fossil fuels and the exposure of pipelines and their impacts on health and environment around these indigenous communities and local people. And it's really crucial to remember how these people are never highlighted nor discussed sort of in these kind of processes. So to me as a Palestinian, seeing that it's the same countries, or sorry, the same corporations that are fueling the genocide, that are also extracting from these people and from these communities, it's really crucial to center their own struggles in order to actually build mutual aid systems, in order to actually build solidarity. It's not about Palestine, it's not about the genocide. What's happening in Palestine, sure, as I said, is a microcosm of the world and how things are run and the systems that we witness. But I think what is more important is actually being human and being in touch with your own humanity and being in touch with other forms of humanity, or without even othering. We're all humans, one and the same. And it's just about opening your eyes and seeing that it's beyond borders, it's beyond continents. So I'll just pause here and to allow sort of space for more questions, but I'll hand it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Mohammed. And before you kind of step off and hand back to Sinead, just say thank you so much. And I know how much you put into going to COP and really connecting these issues constantly. So massively appreciated. We are coming up to final moments now, so thank you to everybody for participating today. It's been fantastic, and there was a suggestion for a question that we should be asking our panelists. If you had a list of things like demands or pledges that you would like to see from our government, please share with us. Our panelists were selected today because of the alignment with our 6 key demands that we have had shared around the national demo and for the Mass Lobby. Those are on Stop Climate Chaos's website. And finally, I'm just going to share the link to Mass Lobby if you haven't signed up for it already. It's happening on the 3rd of December. And it's a great moment now to come and meet your decision makers and really bring back these issues that we've heard today from our speakers. So it's in Buswells in Dublin. It's between the hours of 11 and 8 p.m. And you can sign up on our website or you can scan the QR code here. I just want to bring everybody together and thank you to Dearbhla, Ross, Sinead and Mohammed for your time, and wish you all the best for the next few days as the end of the negotiations wrap up. So sending you a lot of positivity, a lot of energy, and thank you for raising the issues around like our shared struggle, and yeah, just really bringing it home to us here in Dublin on a much chillier evening. Okay, so I thank you so much, and if anyone wants to get in touch, you'll be able to find us on the Stop Climate Chaos website or on Instagram. And the sharing of this video will come through your emails and on YouTube in the next few days. So thank you so much.
Everyone, take care.
Thank you all.
Bye.